Hi everyone. This is Janie Hill, and for my final presentation, I am doing Inuit stories in children's literature for LAS 516. So, an oral tradition is a culture's collection of spoken words that have been handed down for a generation. Repetition is a central part of oral tradition. The words are heard many times throughout a person's life. Stories are told and retold. Eventually, they become an integral part of an individual's sense of identity in everyday life. Inuit stories is a repository of the culture, past traditionally, which is traditionally incorporates all aspects of daily life. And there's been a recent resurgence in popularity among oral stories which are aimed to preserve traditional teachings as both a method of culture and political solidarity. The most common stories often depict animals and humans in close relationship with the ability to communicate with one another. There are also many stories meant to teach children of safety and respect of the land. There was also stories to teach how different areas and landmarks got their names. And there's also stories that discuss behavioral codes that allow individuals to fully understand how to live within the Inuit society. Okay. Elders are the living memory of their community. Past generations depend upon elders to pass along their stories, and future generations depend on young to learn and remember the elders' knowledge. Each generation is a link in a chain that connects the past. Oral stories also teach practical skills such as house building, hunting, collection, preparation of medicinal plants, healing ceremonies, knowledge of fishing and sports, and migratory routes. The sharing in this knowledge traditionally bound individuals and families together within a common understanding of life and how it should be properly lived. Oral, oral stories are very much a social experience. Oral stories normally require at least two people, one to speak and another to listen. Members of the community, most often the old and young, spent a lot of time together, so it was mostly the elders that told the stories to the children. Oral stories reinforced interpersonal relationships. So now I'm going to move into the author Michael Kazugak after we had our little discussion on Inuit oral stories. Michael Kazugak is one of the few Inuit that has written or has translated stories in Inuktitut and has written them into English. He was born in Cape Fullerton on the west coast of Hudson Bay, and before the age of 11, Kazugak's family lived a traditional nomadic lifestyle before they eventually settled in Rankin Inlet. He went to residential school in Chesterfield Inlet and also completed his high school, becoming one of the first Inuit in the Eastern Arctic region to complete his high school. His stories mainly focus on Nunavut, since oral stories tend to vary from region to region, so they don't necessarily reflect the Northwest Territory or Yukon. He's written 8 picture books, 1 young adult novel, and he's co-written 1 comic book. He is the winner of the Ruth Swartz Award for Children's Literature for his picture book Northern Lights to Stalker Chills in 1994, and he's the winner of the Vicki Metcalf Award for Children's Literature in 2008. The reason he decided to write Inuit stories is in an interview he talks about reading a Dr. Seuss book with his sons, and it was at that moment he realized that there wasn't a lot of children's books for Inuit that were that weren't written in a biased or kind of romanticized way. And it was at that moment that he wanted to write stories that accurately represented the Inuit culture. So here's just a list of the books that he's written, and we're gonna talk. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the Curse of the Shaman, Arctic Comics, which is my favorite, my Arctic 123, and Baseball Bats for Christmas. So in an interview, they asked him, if it was difficult to translate oral stories into English, and he said, the Inuktitut language is such a wonderful storytelling language. It's very descriptive. It flows so well. English is so technical. It's very, very hard to write in English when you come from an Inuktitut background. So the way he overcomes this obstacle is that he reads aloud the story in English, and he'll write it down and he'll read it out loud over and over again until a story achieves a feeling of authenticity. And the result is a unique storytelling voice that reflects Kazuzak's. And he makes a good point that when you tell a story, it's up to the storyteller. So every storyteller has their own way of sharing stories to the listener. And according to Forrester and Saltman, they make a good point that Kazugak's children's books are an intercultural project. It draws upon the oral stories. It uses English text and illustrations to expose but rewrite stereotypes about Inuit and Northern life in Nunavut. So here's a little excerpt from The Curse of the Shaman. If you stand high on a hill in Rankin Inlet, a small community halfway up the western shore of Hudson Bay in Canada, and look east, way east, past Thompson Island, you'll see a mirage. Yes, a real mirage, a shimmering white island that floats just above the horizon. Curse of the Shaman is Kazuzak's first novel, directed at a young adult reader, and it takes place pre-European contact and tells the story of the sea goddess. The English translation is the one down there, and also another supernatural being known as the Eternal Wanderer. And both figures are very important in Inuit culture. But you'll notice in this particular book, and I'll show in another example, these kind of long meandering sentences, and they tend to address the reader directly, even incorporating questions someone might ask if they were sitting there listening to a story. Is there a real mirage? Someone might ask. And Kazuzak says, yes, there's a real mirage, as if anticipating the reader's question. It's unique to Kazuzak's books, and its simple prose are meant to flow like an oral story, drawing the reader in as if they were listening to Kazuzak himself. Now, he tends to do this more in the novel and the comic book that I'll look at. In his picture books for the younger kids, he does use simple sentences, just so that they're able to read it and have a better understanding of what's happening in the story. But for the novel, he uses these really long, meandering sentences that don't necessarily follow the rules of English grammar. So here's another excerpt. The man with no eyebrows had eyebrows, of course, just as Can't See. Can't See is the wife of the man with no eyebrows. Could actually see. That was just his name. It was a good name. It had been passed down from generation to generation until it came to him. The first, the man with no eyebrows, probably had no eyebrows at all, Or maybe his eyebrows were so faint that people had started to call him the man with no eyebrows. It had probably started as a nickname, finally becoming his name when people forgot what his real name was. So the rhythmic pace of the prose mimics the flow of the Inuit language. And what's really important in oral stories, in Inuit oral stories, is repetition, as I mentioned before. He'll say something once and again, and he'll come at it from a different angle, maybe rewording it just a little bit, but he's still repeating maybe names or such as the man with no eyebrows. And this is a traditional way of how characters were often introduced in oral stories. So, baseball bat for Christmas. A lot of his children's stories are often drawn from his own personal history growing up in Rankin Inlet in the 1950s and 60s. Um, so there's this felt knowledge that he's sharing with his readers. This is, you know, his childhood memory. It's authentic. It's not romanticized. It's not, a colonial perspective. It's his own experiences, and it's his way of kind of breaking away or trying to 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 change a reader's perspective of what it's like to live up in the Arctic. So the story, it's like I said, it comes from Kazuzak's childhood experience of Christmas in 1955. Um, just like other children his age and living up in the Arctic, they have never seen trees before. And in the book, in the story, and when he was a child, the children referred to them as standing ups. And when the Hudson Bay Company brought some trees up as a gift and also to teach um, the locals about Christmas and decorating trees, um, the kids simply think that the trees are meant to be used as new baseball bats because they love playing baseball, and they didn't really understand Christmas and decorating trees. They just thought, well, these trees are gifts to make baseball bats. So they end up in a funny way. They end up breaking off the branches to use as baseball bats because sticks are really scarce to find up in the Arctic. So it's to Kazuzak's childhood. Um, it's more of a distinction. It's not claimed between colonial and Inuit traditions, but it's just to the perspective of a child. Um, Christmas is new, and it's kind of telling you a funny, humorous story of basically two distinct cultures colliding without the full knowledge of each other's traditions. But he's also, in a very nuanced way, telling you or introducing you to kind of the slow kind of colonizing aspect from the south. The Hudson's Bay Company, they have a church, and he refers to the Canadian flag as a Union Jack, which was what it was called before it became the Canadian flag. Okay. So now I'm going on to an even simpler book, My Arctic 123. These are very short sentences. This is for very young children that are learning how to count. But you'll notice on the page at the very bottom, there's the Inuit Slavic, which not only is he teaching, English readers how to count, but he's also teaching young Inuit how to read in Inuktitut. They have the Slavic symbols that they use, and this one stands for wolf. So my Arctic 123 is a counting book that conveys the interconnectedness of all living things in the Arctic. In the brief introduction that Cusack writes for this book, he describes the important role animals play in Inuit life, and as a child he spent many hours observing wildlife as a young boy, which was necessary for when he got older to hone his skills as a hunter. He further expands that the book's minimal text by telling stories of interactions he and his family had with animals in Rankin Inlet. Sorry, I just lost my thought there. Okay, so now we are moving on to Arctic comics. Okay, so this is probably his a really good example of how, and he's mentioned this before in an interview, that in terms of oral stories, plot development kind of runs in all directions. And it's only at the end of the story that you see a pattern of how things, fit together. There's really no middle, there's no beginning. Everything just kind of transitions into another event. And these events could be very distinct from each other and could happen in different, times. But he says that's part of oral storytelling, is that when you tell a story, there's so many elements that the story is constantly changing. It's not when you write something down on like a children's book where you have a beginning, middle, and end. Oral stories don't follow that. Inuit oral stories don't necessarily follow that pattern. So with this one, I'm not sure if you can see, but we really he really flushes out the repetition, but also the rhythmic prose. I feel like the comic book is a really good choice to really illustrate his way of writing uh, simple sentences that kind of mimic the Inuktitut language. And it says, "We wait and we wait for seals to surface all summer long, watching the surface of the sea, tiny waves lapping on the rocks, climbing up the beach only to recede again, waving the seaweeds. Tiny jellyfish come and go, only to empty again. There is no rush. There is time for the mind to wander. I see it now. I see it now. A great expanse of very flat ice with a thin dusting of snow." What I like most about this is it's kind of honing in on thought phrases within sentences. And I think I mentioned before, he says it once, he says it again, and he comes at it from different angles. And the transitions from panel to panel allows for this rhythmic pace of prose without it being broken up. And this is the same story, and just like the last two panels were about a young boy that's waiting for seals to come in because he's hunting them, this the story all suddenly transitions into it's at night and they're playing soccer and it's the Northern Lights. So it kind of goes back to what I mentioned before, that oral stories kind of transition into completely different events or aspects of the story. There's no beginning or end. It just kind of goes from one point to another point. So all night long in the moonlight run, follow each other, whistle at them, see them coming closer, rub your nails together, watch them go farther. For it is said the Northern Lights are the souls of people who have died. My grandfather is up there playing soccer with the rest of them. In the early days of spring when days are long, the nights lacking. Some stay a day, some stay a week. Hardly anyone stays a month. This story is really close to Kazuzak. He wrote an actual children's version of this comic called The Northern Lights: The Soccer Trail. And it's a story that his grandmother told him growing up to kind of to understand the concept of death. Um, Certainly in the 1950s and 60s, and it's still an issue now, but tuberculosis, um, it killed a lot of Inuit, and it's still an issue today. And his grandmother, when teaching him to understand death, brought in a Western element. The kids his age, they were playing soccer, and she seen that they were, you know, they understood soccer. So in order to teach him about death, she incorporates soccer into the story of how the Northern Lights are the souls of their relatives. And she says, just like how you play soccer on the ice, they play soccer in heaven, but they kick a walrus hit around. Um, and one day, if you look up, you can see them playing soccer, so they're always with you. They haven't really left you. And so Kazuzak, like many other authors, indigenous authors, they turned to Western books in order to kind of alter the ethnocentrism of Canada and to bring hope and healing to their communities, as he says, set the story straight. So he's giving you, the reader, a glimpse into um, Inuit culture and lifestyle from his perspective. It's an unbiased and, like I said, unromanticized perspective. He's taking the effort of translating Inuktitut stories into English and then putting them on paper, which is another challenge. But he's doing it in a way that it kind of mimics the language, so that you get kind of a feeling of how the language flows if you were to sit there and listen to the stories. So that concludes my presentation on Inuit oral stories and children's books. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any questions, I look forward to talking to everyone on the discussion forum. Thank you.